Hello and welcome to Black Lives Matter in the Asia Pacific, a panel discussion exploring how the global movement against racism resonated deeply for West Papuan people in Indonesia and Indigenous Australians. This event is presented by The Conversation. We are a nonprofit media network that produces evidence-based news and analysis from academics and researchers. And this particular event is jointly organized by The Conversation Indonesia and The Conversation Australia. My name is Prodita Sabarini. I'm the executive editor of The Conversation Indonesia, and I'm very thankful to our speakers who have agreed to provide their time, their insight, share their experience, and speak about systemic racial discrimination and violence, a critical issue that deeply affects Black people around the world. We're joined by Elvira Rumkabu, lecturer of international relations at Cendrawasih University, and Eddie Synot, a Wamba Wamba First Nations person and the center manager of the Indigenous Law Center at UNSW. Eddie and Elvira, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you for being here. I think I will start our discussion with a question for you first, Elvira. We've been horrified after seeing the image of George Floyd, an African-American being pinned down by the police to his death. And then young people in the US have marched to protest police violence and systemic racism. And that movement have grown into a global movement and has come also to our shores in Indonesia and Australia. And you have written a powerful article for the Jakarta Post about how this global fight against racism resonated deeply for Papuans. Can you share with us more about that and how Papuans in Indonesia experience racism in their everyday lives? I think some of our viewers might know about what's happening, but I think a lot of people also don't really know exactly what it is like the experience of Papuan people.
Okay, thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank the conversation for bringing this issue and to discuss about the racism, because our voices, our West Papua narrative have been underrepresented, especially in the international fora. So I really appreciate this forum. When we talk about the racism, I mean, it's very interesting. It's for West Papuan, it is in our day-to-day affairs, but it's rarely discussed. We need momentum every time we want to talk about the racism, and we had our political momentum last year in 2019, but now we have our momentum now after the Black Lives Matter. What I can say is, so there is now a debate about that, about the racism, whether it exists or not. There is some kind of denial. But as a movement, we have to admit that West Papuan people have been in a systemic racism and oppression for the decades. But let me elaborate this, make it simple and make it more from my personal experiences. I am a privileged indigenous West Papuan in 2003, where I went to one of the best university in Indonesia. And I thought that I was privileged because there are just 1, 2, 3 indigenous, very rarely indigenous Papuan to be enrolled in that university. But what I thought I was privileged, and I found that I was actually different at the time. I had a really good academic report at the time, but then I remember one time in the room when we had a discussion with the lecturer, and this lecturer actually taught the student about how primitive West Papuan is, how the West Papuan students are alcoholic, how they're so lazy, and all of the students in the class, they were looking at me because I'm the only West Papuan at the place, and I was so feel inferior. So I realized that it's not just about me that different because of my skin color, skin tone, but it's also a feel of sense of separateness with other Indonesian. And I feel like this is what I feel, that I feel so inferior. It must be something wrong with my identity. At that time, 2003, I was thinking it's me. It was me that have the problem. It was me who are inferior. It is something wrong with the Papuans that are inferior compared to other Indonesian. But let me bring you to the move forward to 2016. I wrote on my article when I saw the George Floyd's image, the disturbing image, how George Floyd was kneeled down by the police. It was exactly the same with the Obi Kogoya West Papuan students who were kneeled down by the police, who was dragged on asphalt, kicked and punched, and the police put their fingers on the nostril of the Obi Kogoya, and it was being captured. And it was so disturbing to see how we find it as normal, how the police brutality at them was normal to the West Papuan students. I was so sad at the time because we don't have the kind of solidarity like now at that time in 2016. It was so disturbing because afterwards, Obi was fine, but Obi was sentenced, got, I don't know, 6 or 7 months in the jail. He didn't do anything wrong. He was not criminals. They were there for the very peaceful protest for our aspiration, but that's what they got. They have to be criminalized for their aspiration, decriminalized for the thoughts. So this is definitely racist. In 2019, I mentioned before about we gain our political momentum. 2019, just last year, in August until September, there were anti-protest, anti-racism protests around West Papua because of this incident in Surabaya where the West Papuan student got racist slur, called them, the police and also the Indonesian nationalists called them a monkey. It triggers our emotion, it makes us angry, it triggers our humanity. And all of the people in West Papua, they move forward and they make their own protests, and they uh, deliver the aspirations. They reject that dehumanizations. But then the response was so, I would say the response was so racist by the government at the time. Can you imagine? They just delivered the aspiration, but then after the demonstration, the government sent military troops. There are approximately 60,000 additional military and police from other region being sent to West Papua during August to December at the time. It's not enough. The government also cut the internet because what? Because they think West Papuan people are so destructive. Because they think that the West Papuan people cannot hold a genuine conversation or dialogue talking about their own dignity. So they sent the military troops, and the local government was not working at the time. And also they arrest activists. If we look at the bad data of the coalition, there are approximately 1,000 activists who was being detained, who was being arrested. 69 of them were charged with the treason articles. It was, for me, it doesn't make any sense at all. What I want to say just by presenting these examples, I believe that, of course, Papuan experienced systemic racism and oppression for decades. At the societal level, it manifests through our interactional, it manifests through our daily interaction. It manifests through the negative representation of Papuan as a destructive people, as a lazy people, primitive, underdeveloped. It is still until now. It's still resonated with us. And also, the racism manifested to the discriminatory, exclusionary, and oppressive states policy and practices. I mentioned before about how the government responded to the anti-racism protest in 2019. So for me, if we look at the racism in West Papua, it's not just at the societal level, but I found racism is actually racism and stigmatization of West Papuan people as the foundation of the police of the Indonesian government policy to West Papuan, and it justify the coercive power, it justify the violence, the use of violence to West Papuan people, and racism has a very destructive effects to West Papuan people, and one is that it's very important to mention is that one of the implication of racism is that it kills our discussion about the humanitarian issues in Papua, because we are being constructed to think about Papua as a separatist people. We don't want to stand with solidarity because we said that is the internal problem. They want to separate, then it has to be the Indonesian and West Papuan people problem. No, this racism open our discussion that let's see West Papuan issues as the humanitarian issues. They're talking about the human dignity. They're talking about something that's so emotional, something that related with their human status. Yeah, I think that's what I can say for the beginning.
Thank you so much, Elvira. That is very comprehensive description about the experience of racism towards West Papuan, and not just in the everyday lives, but this really coercive power from the state as a result of the racism that's entrenched in our society at the moment in Indonesia. I would like to now go to Eddie. Is this story that Elvira just shared with us? How does that resonate with the Indigenous experience of Australian Indigenous people? Is there any similarities, or is there any difference? And can you share with us about the experience in Australia?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for the opportunity also. And thank you for Elvira, sorry for that description, and that powerful discussion that you've just given as well about the situation with West Papua. And just at the outset, I guess, some of those key fundamentals that you're talking about the human aspect of it, about who we are as human beings, and the way that West Papuans are characterized, and share so many similarities with the history of racism in Australia with regards to Indigenous peoples, and what we experience today as well. And some of those, well, all of those attitudes about the primitive nature, or the stereotypical characteristics of Indigenous people, those experiences that Indigenous people have as an everyday aspect of their lives, that was spoken about, whether it's in the classroom, whether it's at school. I can just think of one example recently that resonated with the example that was just given then, of a school teacher that made the media in Australia, doing the same thing again about Indigenous people being lazy and being drunks and not contributing. Those very mundane everyday experiences of racism that hurt so much and are so much part of the experience of being an Indigenous person in Australia. Whether it's across the kind of varied places that we live in Australia, in urban areas, remote regional areas, each with their own differences, but those fundamental aspects of racism impact Indigenous peoples regardless of the situation. And with West Papua, there are obviously some very important differences that I wouldn't want to take away from that the West Papuan people are facing, with regards to the response of the government to their activism, and as was spoken about the shutting down of discussions that we experience in a different way here in Australia. But I think the point about the similarities of racism and those fundamentals about the beliefs that inform it, the way that it becomes or has become ingrained systematically in institutions, in culture, and so much so that it just becomes part of the everyday practice of here in Australia, whether it's the cultural attitude of Australians, and not just talking of the traditional idea of European or Anglo-Australians as well, but more recent revivals to the country that adopt those kind of attitudes towards Indigenous peoples. But also, in our criminal justice system, in our schools, in the institutions in society that are supposed to be able to, that are supposed to be there to be able to provide you with all the things that you need in life to be able to, around you as a community, to be able to succeed, to be happy, to be healthy, are geared and have this deeply embedded racist attitude towards Indigenous peoples. And it's one of our hardest things to break. And it's one of the continuing legacies of our long history that we refuse to address. And At the outset, we spoke about the images that came out of America and the response to it about George Floyd. And, we have all of our own examples here of that. There's an inquiry going on, or has been going on, for some time, into young Indigenous men. There's a video that's available online for people to be able to see where the life is choked out of him as well by a bunch of prison guards. And it's this system of racism and this culture of racism that has enabled those responsible for his death to, not just to get away with it, but it's a system and a culture that excuses and enables people to get away with that behavior. It enables Indigenous peoples and their bodies and their culture and our families to be able to be treated differently to other people. So when we talk about, entering into the criminal justice system or any kind of interaction, when we're talking about duty of care and responsibility, then, if you're an Indigenous, if you're a Black body, if you're a Black person in this country, then, it's not only statistically, but, anecdotally, if you speak to anyone, the experience is of being treated as someone less human. The degrading nature of that and how it plays out. And it was something that, just hearing that there are so many similarities that strike a chord with that experience of racism. And that came through with the George Floyd episode that we did see, and the continuing experiences that we have here in Australia. And the Australian response particularly is one where, as a nation or a particular kind of dominant culture, we like to pretend that we've done a lot over the last 3 decades for reconciliation politics, or that we're, moving in a different direction. But we haven't really addressed in any serious, substantive, structural way the systemic nature of racism in this country. So we do a lot of performative things. We have a lot of, meetings. We have a lot of morning teas. We have a lot of publicity and language and speak around this. And, you both spoke about the systemic nature of racism and how it embeds itself into these institutions and continues to impact people in this way. And it's something that we've completely failed at in this country, whilst we've continued to kind of pat ourselves on the back for doing a good job. And, our response is, we'll have a report, we'll do a royal commission, there'll be an inquiry, someone might say sorry if you're lucky, there'll be some recommendations to change behaviour into the future, and then we repeat that cycle. And Indigenous people keep dying, whether it's in the criminal justice system, we keep being, our families experience racism in those ways, and the cycle kind of continues. And it has been encouraging, at least out of this most recent kind of momentum, and that was spoken about in the last kind of point made too, about just how important momentum is around these kind of things, that we're not just going to let the conversation die down this time, that people are picking up that momentum and are demanding and are asking better questions and looking to actually, force and change and move that momentum into action itself to actually be able to address some of those more substantive structural issues.
I'd like to take something out of that, as you say that the momentum is really important to continue the conversation, to continue the activism. The way that you describe it, Eddie, is that there are some work around trying to deal with the racism that's happening in Australia, but it's more performative rather than structural. And I'd like to ask a question to both of you. How has this momentum, this global movement, the Black Lives Matter that started in the US, moved around the world, in Europe, and now also in Indonesia and Papua, and also in Australia, how has it reinvigorate the activism? Is it has it been helpful, or are you still facing a lot of challenges? How are you dealing with this? And have you seen connections between different activism in different countries, which are working on the same issue, racism, and connecting to each other?
Me
Yeah.
first? Okay. Let me start. Uh, so in my introduction, I appreciated the conversation because I said that we have very limited space when it comes to talk about our issues to the international audience. So for me, we especially about the discussion of racism. If you look at back the root of the racism in West Papua, it traced back to the Dutch colonialisms, and we have I don't touch that issue before, but what I want to say that we have a long history of racism since the Dutch colonialism, when the Dutch put the administration what they call as a dual colonialism system, where it actually changes the social structure, put the Dutch elite, Dutch official on the top of the society. The second one, they have Indonesian people, because these Indonesian people are more privileged, so they become the doctors, the teachers, the missionaries. The West Papuan people, they are at the bottom of the society. What makes things worse is because it's not just also the social construct, but the stigmatization given to the West Papua as a primitive, underdeveloped, and I already mentioned before, it is was maintained and was believed by the Indonesian government. So when Indonesia took over West Papua, the same racist thoughts about the West Papuan, the same legacy from the Dutch colonialism also being adopted in the policy, development policy in Indonesia. So when the Suharto, especially the President Suharto, one of the, what I call is as a racist, maybe not all of the people like it, but I thought one of the manifestation is the biggest project called it transmigration. So basically the government allow many people from the Java Islands, Sulawesi, to Indonesia. If you look at the narrative from the government at the time, it was not just for the economic benefits, but it actually the racist thoughts of the government thought that the West Papuan people have to be civilized. They have to learn from these Javanese people. They have to be modernized. So what the government do at the time is they Indonesianize us. Our indigenous languages were forbidden. Even at the Suharto time, you cannot mention the name Papua because it was so political. It was attached to our identity. And there are a lot of the systemic policies at the time that really push aside our identity. What I want to say from this related to your question is we have also a long history of violence since the Suharto era until now. What I want to say is the discussion of racism was not on the table. We didn't discuss the racism. We don't put racism as the root of the conflict. We talk about the certain policies. We think it's only it's because we thought that this is normal because West Papua want independence. So let's send military. It's important to use the gun for the West Papuan people every time they talk. Then we just criminalize their thought. It's just their aspiration, but let's criminalize them using the existing racist laws, for instance. What I want to say is we don't really look that actually the foundation was the racism in the thoughts of the government, but also at the society, which normalized the racism and think it's normal for West Papuan to be treated that way. So when now we have this momentum, a lot of people, some of the journalists ask me, the do Papuan always need momentum? For me, like we need momentum because we are living in a very limited space. There is restriction of journalism. You cannot come to West Papua, so we always need momentum to connect the struggle at home with the international. So this is the momentum. So it's really important what happened in United States. It's deeply rooted, deeply related to us because now, for the very first time, the other Indonesian people, the nice Indonesian people ask us indirectly, said, are we racist? How do we racist? That question is very important. It takes like more than 50 years for us to reach that question. So for me, I'm so emotional to see all the webinars. It's okay. We don't know how to move forward after this, but at least we open up a discussion about are we racist? How do we racist? What should we do? What should we do so that we can be in solidarity with you? Not all of the people, of course, be supporter of this discussion. Some of the leading academics said that this is not systemic racism. It's okay. I mean, they're always like that. Some people will be like that, but it's important. This momentum is that the narrative of the indigenous West Papuan to be put and to be prioritized. It's time for the West Papua narratives to be put at the first priority. So for me, this is what is the good things about the how it ignites with our struggle is that because it gives us space to really talk about the racism. We have a genuine conversation about racism. We want to see racism, and if we want to fight the racism, we have to make it explicit. We have to talk about it, and it means that you must have genuine conversation. Some Indonesian, I said that not all of the Indonesian people are racist, of course, not all of Indonesia, but a lot of people in Indonesia, especially in West Papua, they get benefit from this systemic racism. They've got privilege because of the systemic racism that we created and we maintain for decades. So for me, it's an emotional discussion about the racism, but also the most important thing is how do we move forward after this? When we talk about the challenges, I think that the first challenges that I have mentioned before, that in West Papuan discussion, what we know always that whether we always push into the binary of whether the discussion of the political aspiration of getting independence or about how important for Indonesia to maintain their sovereignty. So this always about the discussion about the West Papua, and every time like West Papuan talk about their humanitarian aspiration, talk about how their land have been grabbed, how they want to just express what they thoughts about something, and it's easily for them to be criminalized. This is the challenges. The challenges is how we have been constructed into this binary. So it is important for us, I mean, as a collective, to really construct this and to see the West Papuan issue as an issue of aspiration of people to not to be aspiration of people to be treated equally as a human, and that's, I think this is the time to not just to have a genuine conversation, but also to change the way we see Papua. And I think another challenge is, I think it's really good, of course, to see how we now thinking about let's have some networking with other. We don't really know how we're gonna do this networking things, but what I think is really important is let's talk about what is the specific agenda that we want to push. It's important to have solidarity, but it's more important to have specific agenda how we can make a fundamental changes for the West Papuan people. It's very important to the challenges for me is how to keep the conversation going on and how to keep it as a moral aspiration of the West Papuan people, but also how we must come up with specific agenda. For instance, in United States, they have a discussion about the defund police, or they're talking about that kind of things, policy, specific policy to respond to the police brutality. I think it's important now for the international solidarity, especially to think about what is actually the specific change we want to push, setting the agenda, and especially about the violence. For me, the violence was so obvious. So it's really important that is what we have to do, but also that's a challenge is to set up what is the specific agenda that we want to do. Last thing that I want to say that also that one of the articles said that visibility is not influence. So it's important not just to be visible, but also to be influenced. Keep the conversation going on, be visible, but it's more important that we need to bring a positive influence to the West Papuan people's life.
Thank you, Elvira, for that background for where the racism has come in Indonesia, that we have to look back to the Dutch colonial era and how then that really entrenched way of looking towards Papuan people in a different way contributes to that systemic racism, and how this movement can help us look and see that there is that root cause of racism. And as you mentioned, you're so correct that when we talk about Papua, we often don't talk about the basic root of racism in Indonesia and towards Papuan people. And so the movement has kind of like opened the eyes of people that, hey, have I been racist? How have I contributed to the oppression and continual violence against Papuan people? What about in Australia, Eddie? How has this reinvigorate the activism in Australia?
I think very similarly, it's important to recognize or to understand the deeply ingrained nature and the deep history of racism in Australia, and who Australia is as a country, how it came about, even our role in the region with Papua, with New Guinea as colonial authorities, as the Australian government itself, throughout our history as well. And this year in Australia, it's 250 years since Captain James Cook came to discover us, apparently, and everything else that comes with that. And so there's been a changing kind of momentum building in Australia that's been getting bigger and bigger over the last couple of years. That's really been led by Indigenous activists themselves, and the growing support from non-Indigenous allies as well. And one of the risks that we always kind of face, and something that kind of happens a lot in Australia, is when we see these examples. So I remember back to the Ferguson, riots in America, and automatically there's a denial of the issues of racism in Australia. And Australia has a very big problem with denying our racist history and denying that racism is an issue today. But I do think genuinely with the current momentum that has been building, and with the the scenes that we saw with George Floyd and the movement that's been building around the world, is that there has been a difference in the way that Australians have received that message and have picked that up. And rather than, there are still the people that are denying that it's an issue here and that we're importing American issues, and similar kind of denials, and from all corners of society. But something that I sense, and when talking to colleagues and friends and other people, that there is a real sense of an understanding that it is happening in our own backyard, and it has been happening here for a long time, that it is deeply ingrained in the position and the place of Indigenous people in Australia today. And that sense too that was spoken about just before, about the need to be able to transform that into action, to be able to do something substantively, to be able to change this. So, and sometimes, I do think it is okay that we don't know exactly, where we're heading or what to do on some of the bigger questions. But one of the things that I think is important, and I assume it would apply, to the West Papuan people as well, is that as we've been experiencing, racism for so long, we understand it. We've researched it. We know what needs to happen. We know what needs to change. And it's about this conversation now, and the way it's been mobilizing the momentum, getting the people in those right positions that, whether it's relinquishing. So for us in Australia, in the structural positions within government, within institutions, and communities themselves, them realizing too that the way that they've gone about things isn't good enough anymore. And that, it's not enough just to change. We have this quite insidious policy in Australia called closing the gap, which has been around since 2007. And it identifies a number of gaps in life expectancy, education outcomes, health outcomes, similar things to like that, between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. And the government kind of continually reports on it, has full control over, funding and the government services that go into it. And so in that way, we become suffocated by the allocation of resources and the control of institutions and the control of culture. So whilst we don't have, our media and our internet being blocked and banned like the West Papuans face, the way that we are suffocated in our country is through the allocation of resources, through the diminishing of our voices and refusing to hear us in that space, and the absolute refusal to relinquish control or power over us as a people in our communities. But I think, what has been encouraging, and there's still, we shouldn't kid ourselves that it is a massive challenge and there is still a long way to go, but that people are waking up to the realities and hearing our stories. So conversations like this, the amazing opportunity to have this conversation internationally, but within our own region as well. And too often, a lot of Australians will look to America or look to elsewhere without actually looking in our own region too, in the Pacific, and in what's happening here in our neighbouring countries. So absolutely, that momentum has been key. And I think that sense of solidarity, which has been something from our own, activism throughout our own history with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, since we've been fighting, we've always been able to find and develop these relationships of solidarity to be able to help network through these things. And obviously they're not enough alone on themselves, and it's now about transforming that into action and how we're able to do that. But those relationships and these conversations are very much part of that, and being able to do that. And it is something that I've been encouraged to see a different, not a straight out different, but more emphasis and momentum on actually recognizing the differences here in our own, the problems in our own country and what we can do about that. Rather than, like I said, pointing to America and saying how bad and racist they are, and that everything is kind of, happy and roses and sunshine here in Australia.
It does seem that with the world being exposed to the horrifying tragedy that happened to George Floyd, it makes people look into and check whether that is happening here in our own communities. So yeah, definitely, that's, I think, one of the most powerful thing from the US is that it, instead of like making people point to like, wow, how bad is racism in America, but we're checking ourselves as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to add to that, sorry. And yeah, absolutely. It really emphasizes the point for me about a problem in Australia, and with the denial of these issues and the denial of racism, with regards to Indigenous peoples, but also, in our region, and, our government's own response to some of the humanitarian situations within our region, and with regards to West Papua and stuff like that too. Australia's attitude to race is one of ignorance and denial, and it is encouraging to see that shift. And we need to be able to keep an eye on that and to build that and to ensure that shift turns into action itself. But it has been encouraging to see that shift.
And I also feel.
Sorry, Mayra, you're mute. You're still muted.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so I also like amazed with how like it's automatically like one thing happened in United States, and then like black, white, brown people, like just every people like talk about that our lives matter, especially Indigenous people's lives matter. And for me, like when see that picture, I think what actually trigger our solidarity is, of course, our anger that we share, but also as I mentioned before, is that I feel like we share blackness, not as blackness as a racial categorization, but blackness as an aspiration to be treated equally, to be treated as human, and to check, are we really treated as human? Are we really treated equally with other citizens in our country? So let's do this checking, something like that. So I think it's how we see this movement as blackness, but blackness not as a racial categorization, but blackness as an aspiration to have a better future, to have equality, to have justice. So that's what actually trigger us. That's what actually triggered all the movement around the world.
I'm going to go to a question from the audience. There is a question from James McCall. He asked, how can we support and empower emerging Papuan leaders without too concerns, putting these young leaders at risk from arrest and violence, and support leaders of movements without raising concern with the government of Indonesia about the independence movement? I guess this question would be to you, Elvira.
Eddie, you have to help me in this question. So it's a question of like it's a 1 million question. Like we all thinking about it, like how, especially like I told, how do we support Papua leaders without putting them in the risk, but also without what I said before about the stigmatization as a separatism. I think it's one of the really biggest challenges, and how we can we really separate that. Like I don't know, it's hard. But for me, what we can do, I cannot think of anything but like amplifying voices outside. Like it's easier to amplifying voices outside West Papua instead of in Papua. So what happening now, like many Indonesian NGOs, universities do the webinar, talk about that. It's one example. If you see that in West Papua, there are no, like, we have very limited discussion about racism. The racism discussion actually were hosted by others outside the West Papua. And that's one important thing that we can do is we can amplify the voices without being inside the West Papuan. And of course, it's hard to like, they're always threats to the West Papuan people, intimidation. I mean, it's inseparable. And like for me, I mean, I know the risk talking here. I mean, but I'm prepared. I believe with the solidarity can hopefully can mitigate the threat. But first thing that to that question, I think amplifying the voices without being inside but outside. Um, I cannot think of like, maybe Eddie can help me how can we do that, because that's also our conversation. Like some of the people said that when our issue become in like international issue or being discussed in as international audience, there's always an episode of violence at home. Like it's always like that. Once you talk about racism in international, or maybe talk in the UN or something, there's all like little incident, accident that claim people's random lives inside the West Papua. So it's it's always come with the price, of course. But that's why I think that it's very important to push the bigger agenda. So when I put when I said agenda, I was thinking about how can we mitigate, or how can we de-escalate the violence of the police or the military. How that is actually the real advocacy that we can do, and maybe by pushing your government, especially like Australia government, because the Australia government fund the Tasman 88, the anti-terror here. And how I think that is one of the most important thing is like pursuing the most strategic agenda to de-escalate the conflict, so that can open the discussion about the West Papua, but also to push the government to open the West Papua for the international journalism, international uh, for the international audience. It's very important that's what we can do, so that we can make sure that it not do not harm the people inside. So maybe that's what, maybe, sorry, it's random, but it's a complicated question, because you're also thinking about that. How can you talk without making us here being in this in being threatened? That is actually our biggest homework thing together. Maybe Eddie, you can help me with that.
Yeah, I think it. I mean, I think you've explained that fantastically. As much as I can say from, my obviously privileged position that I sit in here too, and I think there's something that you've emphasized there about. I mean, well, there are two aspects for me, and I think there's something very good in the question itself about the concern for West Papuan people. We don't. Whether it's Indigenous Australians here for West Papuans, we don't need more people speaking on our behalf, or talking over the top of us or taking up. We need our voices amplified. We need people to, vacate space to be able to have these conversations and to be able to drive change. But at the same time, I think fundamentally we are all members of communities, of family groups, larger communities, whatever it is. And we have a fundamental responsibility to other people that we exist within in community together. And for non-Indigenous people, or for Indonesian people, you do have a power, and I think it's a responsibility that comes along with that. Whether it's talking to your government, whether it's organising yourself to have conversations. Here in Australia, I'm involved quite intimately in a process about trying to drive through constitutional reform for Indigenous Australians. And one of the things that I say often, people can feel quite lost as individuals and powerless themselves in what they can do to help to be able to do these things. But we absolutely have the ability to be able to have these conversations. And it's important to make sure those conversations aren't just conversations for the sake of it. It isn't just a little bit of white guilt or a couple of tears and it doesn't go anywhere else and it's a cathartic thing or something like that. It is important to make sure we drive that into action. And I think there is an emotional aspect to all of this and an energy that we feel, and it's about how we can transform and direct that energy into some substantive changes to actually make sure that these things are changing and they're different. And those things can always be grounded, like we're talking about, and the example there before was perfect, in this idea of blackness as belonging, as humanity, as not being something that is, this thing that can be discarded and just discredited so easily. But we absolutely all do, and I'm a very strong believer, have a responsibility as individuals, but not just as individuals, as community members. We can hide and we can isolate ourselves as much as we want. But one of the points that was made before, that our privilege and our ability to be able to do that comes from this history of oppression and systemic oppression of others. We are not disconnected, no matter how far removed we may feel from these things. So for Australians, with what's happening in West Papua, we are absolutely implicated in the history of our government in the region, but also its current relationships, without getting too much into the Indonesian government, the Australian government, and all that other kind of stuff. But there are things we absolutely can do as Australians to amplify those voices and those issues, and to ensure that they're being heard and picked up by a wider audience, to the point that the momentum does build to be able to have an impact and to be able to change those kinds of things. And like I said, always ensuring that it's not just about respect, but there's a responsibility to ensure that we're not speaking for people, we're not taking those places, we're not being mouthpieces. There's probably something that is experienced elsewhere as well, that we experience here in this country, that we're all poor Aboriginals that need saving, that we can't speak for ourselves. We absolutely know what's happening in our communities and what we need to change. And we need support and allies to drive that, to amplify that message, to drive that message home to decision makers, to change the structures themselves. And I think that's something, the network building, the solidarity building across those, it becomes such a big thing that it can't be ignored. That change absolutely does have to happen, and that governments have no other option but to change the way that they do things.
So I think from the answers from you, Eddie, and from Elvira, it's really important to protect this space where the discussion about racism can be continued to be talked about, and not and people are engaged in moving into this discussion, and even if it's uncomfortable, and even if for some people it might feel threatening, but the space has to exist to be able to talk about these things. And another thing is that we have to have a clear agenda of what it is that we want change to happen. And in Indonesia, clearly it would be the end of violence, the end of this coercive power, this control over the thoughts of people that want to express their aspiration to be seen as equal. I'll go back to that question later towards the end of our conversation, but there is one question for you, Eddie, from the audience, is that do you think the Australian government's quest for control has reduced the quality of life for Indigenous Australians in general?
Yes. Very short answer. Absolutely, our government has a very hard time relinquishing control and authority, and you know, they're very quick. Well, our government, the Australian government, our state and territory governments, you know, Indigenous people in Australia are very much impacted by their state and territory governments, as well as the federal or Commonwealth government, through service delivery and provisions and a whole raft of issues. But yes, you know, we have a very paternalistic history in this country about the treatment of Indigenous people, similar to some of the things that were spoken about before about the assimilation of Indigenous people into, you know, the Australian culture, into way of life, and through successive kind of regimes of control and change over those policies, they've kind of waned to different extents. But the inability of the government to relinquish any of that control, you know, over Indigenous people's lives has been and remains one of the mainstays of the issues of Indigenous affairs in Australia. And all of, you know, you can point to any of the reports we've had, all of the recommendations talk about empowering Indigenous peoples through self-determination and being able to make their own decisions and control our own affairs. And they're always, that principle is always pointed to as being key, especially when we're talking about socioeconomic outcomes and indicators and policy reform. And it's, you know, it is what, you know, if not it's one of the key things that the government and bureaucracy in this country refuses to do. They try and dodge it, they try and get around it. They have consultative committees, they have advisory boards, they have advisory groups, and they give the indication, or they, you know, like to pretend that they're relinquishing control. But at the end of the day, they hold the purse strings, they hold the, you know, the legal decision-making capacity and power, and they absolutely have a monopoly on it and refuse to release it. And you know, one of the big points and contentions of reform, especially from Indigenous people, forever in this country, has been about relinquishing that control and being able to be empowered ourselves.
How important is support for the government, or a push for the government to actually carry out the recommendations of the reports? How important do you think is the support from the general public, and not just the Indigenous community, but the general Australian public? And so my question is related to how can non-Black people support the end of systemic racism?
Well, in Australia, the harsh, or the hard reality that we face is that we're only 3% of the population, and the other 90% of the population are either, you know, Anglo-European history, or, you know, a lot more, sorry, and will soon become a majority of the Australian population over the coming decades, from other backgrounds, and, you know, second, third, fourth generation migrant families that have come to Australia as well. So the cultural makeup of Australia is changing itself, the demographics, and, you know, that itself causes a bit more of conflict between that older traditional Anglo culture of Australia as opposed to where it's heading into the future. But we absolutely can't do anything in this country without the support of that 97%. Like I said before, you know, who we are in a community, what responsibilities we have to other people. So being able to have those conversations, being able to build those bridges across communities, but not by ignoring the difficult conversations, by actually going through and having those difficult conversations and talking about what needs to be spoken about and what needs to change. We can't achieve the reforms that we need to achieve in Australia, in this country, without the rest of Australia coming on board with us. A very clear example, like I mentioned before, about constitutional reform that I'm an advocate for, requires a majority vote of the Australian people, and something that I'm involved in called the Uluru Statement from the Heart, and I've been pushing for that when it was issued to the Australian people, and it calls for a First Nations voice in the Constitution and a commission to be able to oversee a process of agreement making and truth telling. And one of the key things with that statement was that it was issued to the Australian people. It wasn't issued to politicians. It wasn't issued to the Prime Minister, because at the end of the day, and it may be a little bit, idealistic and principled to think of it in this way, but the Australian people are the people that have the power to be able to change these things. We elect our politicians. The Parliament is supposed to represent us. All of these kind of things that underpin that. So yes, absolutely, we need your support. We want your support. But that, the second part to your question is, it's very important how you do that. And it's okay if you don't know how to. Just stop and think about what you're doing. And if you're unsure, reach out and ask. The worst thing is just to keep going headstrong, running along and continuing to do things that we have been doing without stopping and thinking about it and without changing. And there's always an immediate demand for action to do things differently. But I think, this is one of the paradoxical things about our situation. There is absolutely always a need to be able to stop and think about what we're doing and how we offer our support. Reach out to Indigenous peoples, reach out to organisations that support, local communities, grassroots organisations that are advocating for reform. There's a whole host of different things that you can do there to be able to amplify and support Indigenous voices that are arguing for this structural reform.
Thank you, Eddie. And I think we're almost at the end of our time. And so I want to ask the last question to Elvira also about how can we move things forward? What would be the best way for non-Black Indonesian people to support change in Indonesia?
I like what Eddie said about stop and thinking. I think it's really important. So there is a one problematic questions keep being asked in a lot of webinars. Some people ask, can we really support the Papuan equality or their fight against racism without supporting their quest for independence? So this is now the question. So people feel that we have to, we don't want to talk about racism because it means that we're going to support the pro-independentists. That's what the discussion going around sometime for now. I think it's like what Eddie said, let's stop and thinking about our questions. But the second thing, this is how the manifestation or how we are so shallow in looking at the West Papuan complexity. We have a very complex problems, and the question is the manifestation of oversimplification of the West Papuan struggle. We need to change the question, and we need to ask why the West Papuan people want the independence. Let's start asking that questions. And when I talk about the binary constructions, about the discussion of West Papua, if you talk about West Papua, it's easily to being stigmatized, and that means you have to talk about how you love Indonesia and how we have to be part of Indonesia. Just these two construction. What I want to say is, first, that the West Papuan people, after being integrated for like almost 50 years, we have the worst human development, the lowest human development index. And amid of our rich in natural resources, we have highest maternal mortality rate, infant mortality rate. Only 5% of Papuan people can have access to the internet. We're talking about how West Papuan, indigenous West Papuan people now, they are struggling very hard to maintain their lands because of a lot of a new capitalistic policy by Jokowi now, more investment, more corporation, MNC came to West Papua and then just grab the West Papuan people, communal land. We're talking about the ongoing violence. What I want to say is we have a very complex problem. It's not just about the pro-independence or pro-Indonesian. That's not that simple. It's not that simple. So when talk about how Indonesia support us, just I think first one is stop and thinking about that question again. And I think one of the strong article written by Lydia Giai, he said that racism is not our problem, it's their problem, it's your problem as Indonesia. I mean, we finished. No one educate us about racism because that's our experience in everyday life. It is you who have to be educated. What I want to say, there are many Indonesian people, but there are a lot Indonesian people who benefit from this systemic racism, and they don't share what we feel. They don't know what we feel being marginalized, being a victim of the racism. So what they have to do is, I think the first thing is, of course, you have to hear more from us, listening to our narrative, give our space so that we can tell. No one will stand up. It's been like 50 decades, 50 years. People always talk and represent us. It is not us who talk about us. So it's time to put our narrative. I am an academic, I'm an indigenous academic, and I quote representative to talk about what we feel. So this is one of the way that we can support each other is by give the space for the West Papuan to build their narrative, hear more from us, because we have so little spaces. Please create spaces for us. And also, I think the most important is after that is about, let's think about the solution. When we stop and thinking and ask the question of why Papua wants independence, there are a lot of lists of how Papuan people are dehumanized, how they are suffering for decades without people listening to them. So let's listen to the silence of the West Papuan, listen to their history, listen to what they want. It's important to know what the West Papuan want. This is what we don't do for like 50 years. We don't ask Papuan people what actually you want. We think they want independence. Let's ask them. Let's ask women, children, young people, senior. Well, they have a lot of narrative. You're gonna be like surprised with their narrative. So stop and thinking about that, and keep the conversation going on. And I think one of the thing of that we can educate ourselves is, I think one of the problem in Indonesia, I think about how the media construct the West Papuan issues. And I'm talking about the mainstream in Jakarta, for instance. I remember one of the issue in last 2019 anti-racism protest, where there was people in West Papua angry because of the racism, and there is burning facilities and stuff. And surprisingly, the head of the national police, Tito Karnavian, made a headline that there are how many I forgot, but non-indigenous people who've been killed. That narrative is so dangerous. When they put non-indigenous people, it's the narrative built by our elite. And because of that, there are many Indonesians who were angry, and they said, okay, we want to go and then we want to kill these people. They are so racist. They are so blah, blah, a lot of things. But what they don't know, after that, there was a report by Jubi Jakarta Post mentioned that there are 17 people, West Papuan, indigenous West Papuan, who were being shot during that time. This is really scary. How West Papuan narrative being put so discriminatory on the media, and we believe that it works like a mantra. We believe that. So I think we have to be careful. If you want to support West Papuan, you have to be really careful in questioning all the media, questioning all the narrative that being put. It's important to see the local narrative, local media, how they put the alternative narrative about what is happening. So maybe that's some point from me. And so and last thing, it's important to be connected, and it's important to keep the conversation going on like this. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you, Eddie. This has been such a valuable conversation. valuable conversation, and it's very educating for me personally, and I hope for everyone who joined and listened and watched this conversation. This is just a beginning. As you say, we haven't been listening to the narratives of Indigenous people, West Papuan people in Indonesia for over 50 years. So we have to keep doing this more. And I'm very thankful to be able to be part of this conversation. Thank you so much, Elvira and Eddie. I hope everyone who watched and joined have learned a lot. And yeah, let's keep the conversation going. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.